Um, yes, I want to remind everyone that the meeting will be recorded. So if you all just heard this meeting will be recorded, know that it is going to be posted on our website for those of you who can't make it for the whole time. So we want to thank our generous sponsors. They include the Organismic and Evolutionary Biology program at UMass, the Graduate Student Senate, the UMass Graduate School, the National Science Foundation, and UMass Give donors like you. So thank you all, everyone who has allowed us to make this possible. We're very excited to finish off our season with an amazing speaker, Dr. Carrie Palmquist, who is coming at us from the Amherst College, local college. So not UMass, but we're so excited to partner with our neighbors. Carrie's gonna talk to us today about her studies in nonverbal communication and learning through childhood. So while you're looking at this screen, this is your last chance to go to menti.com, enter this code. I'm going to switch over so that we can see some of the responses that have been given. And here they are. Oh my goodness. Okay. We've got a lot going on, so this is good. It sounds like when asked what is communication, a lot of people say it's understanding. There's some connection, connecting, listening, signals, speech. Yeah, this is very exciting to get all of your answers. We got receiving and sending and sound and alliance and verbal language and written language. So these are all really excellent questions. Now that we have the audience's answers, or really excellent answers, not questions, but now that we have the audience's answers, I think it's time to go to the professional, the expert. Carrie, how would you define communication?
Yeah, I think this is a really broad term that people across different areas of research have defined in lots of different ways. For the purpose of this talk, we're going to focus primarily on nonverbal communication. And so when we think about that, people have often considered it things like voice quality, right? Like the tone of my voice, body motion, other types of sort of bodily behavior, touch, even things like use of personal space. So like how close am I getting to you and how far am I? So it's obviously really, really broad. But of course, for my research in particular, I'm interested in a sort of subset of nonverbal cues or communication, and we call these pedagogical cues. And this is actually really just sort of like a fancy term that we use to refer to specific cues that are often used when we're trying to share information or are trying to convey something important, right? So a pedagogical situation. And this includes things like sharing gaze, right? So when I make eye contact with you really purposefully before talking, or specifically with kids, we often use something called child-directed speech or baby speech, and we're all sort of familiar with that, right? It's like the ups and downs of the voices that we use when we talk with kids, and also gestures like pointing in particular. And there's research to suggest that human babies are actually pre-wired. They're innately predisposed to pay attention to some of these cues because they're so often paired with important information. They're so often used to cue a time where they should be paying close attention and picking up on the information that's being shared. So that's probably where I would start.
That's awesome. So you explained some verbal communication and some nonverbal communication. They're all under this umbrella. If you want, you can more specifically define nonverbal communication and how you kind of parse out the two of them. But since you already defined both of those two aspects of it, you also dove into the pointing and the gestures and children developing these skills. How does that happen?
Yeah, it's there's actually some debate, of course, in the field about how this actually happens. One sort of prevalent theory, particularly about how pointing develops, is sort of a combination between reinforcement and the development of motor skills. So if we think about very young babies, or thinking like 6 to 10 months old, around this age, babies start to reach out for objects. And sometimes those objects are within reach and they can grab them and great, like goal is reached and all set. And sometimes they're not, sometimes they're out of reach. And so they're outstretching their hand and trying to get that object. And what happens is that usually caregivers pick up the object for them and bring it to them because they see that it's out of reach. And that reinforces that behavior, right? So now babies are reaching out. Whole-handed points is what they're sometimes called early on, right? So reaching out, even though they know they can't actually get that object because they're trying to indicate that they, want that. And then that's reinforced over time. Eventually they start to notice, oh, wait, other people are doing this thing with their finger. Maybe I'll give that a try. And then that gets reinforced because parents and caregivers get really excited once babies start to point out objects. And then it kind of just cycles up from there. So that's one way that we think about how this is happening. And this is all happening before babies turn about a year old. Usually babies, typically developing babies, are pointing with relative frequency by 12 months or so. And it's very reinforcing for them, very reinforcing for caregivers. And so once it starts, it really cycles up quickly after that. But some folks say because it's happening so early, it suggests that this is something that, again, we're, as humans, something unique about this gesture and this way of conveying information that might have some kind of innate foundation to it, given that it's happening so fast and so early in development.
So a lot of the things that you mentioned are picking up on what's in their environment, the people around them, and it sounds like there's a lot of room for culture to impact that. So how could you speak to that?
Yeah, thinking about this cross-culturally is really interesting because what we find in the literature is that there are some things that are really consistent across all cultures, and then there are some things that really vary across cultures when it comes to these types of pedagogical cues, specifically pointing. I actually have some images here that maybe I will show to you all so that you can see some graphs while I talk about these. Let's see. While I talk about these findings, I'll just make sure I can pull up here we go. Hopefully you all can see what I'm seeing here. So there are certainly similarities in terms of thinking about how gestures like pointing develop across cultures. There's this interesting study done by Ulf Liskowski about, I guess it's 8 years ago now. This was hot off the presses when I first started talking about it. So in this particular study, they looked at parents, caregivers, and their children across a wide range of different contexts, different cultures. You can see individuals from sort of Mayan background, folks from Peru, from Canada, Indonesia, Japan. So sort of a very wide range in terms of sort of industrialization versus not, sort of more collectivistic cultures versus more individualistic cultures. And they developed a really easy paradigm. They went into all these different communities and they just sort of brought them into a space that looked like this. So it was decorated with lots of exciting, interesting stimuli to look at. And they wanted to see whether this would elicit pointing from the caregiver and the baby. And in this particular study, these were babies across a sort of age between about 8 months and 14 months or so. And they just let them stay in this space for a little while and looked to see what would happen. And what was really interesting is you can see over here in the graph on the right that this is the mean number of points per minute across the few minutes that they were in this particular setting. And you can see here in the dark bars are how often infants are pointing, and the light bars are how often parents are pointing. And across the board, despite these really dramatic differences across these cultures, they're all pointing at about the same frequency. We can say the parents here on Rossel Island, they're really enthusiastic about pointing out things to their kids, but on a whole, we don't see any statistical differences here, suggesting that one thing that we do see as being similar is that parents and their kids point for each other, even at a very young age, despite lots of cultural differences. But we also see that there are cross-cultural differences as well. And this is another study published the following year, 2013 by Ulf Laskowski and one of his students that also looked at cross-cultural differences. And you can see here they compared a Mayan sort of group of folks to folks living in the Netherlands, so Dutch and Chinese. And they looked both at how parents and caregivers were interacting with their kids, so the quality of their interactions and what sort of made up those interactions. And then they also looked at how often they were producing pointing. So the graph on the left shows you across a 5-minute span how they were spending time together, these dyads between caregivers and their babies between 8 and 15 months. And so you can see the light bars of primary care, right, changing diapers, feeding, that kind of thing, individual activities here in white. But you can see what really sets, for example, the Chinese sample apart is that they're engaging in a lot more of what's called a triadic joint attention type of interaction. So this is, I look at you, I make sure you're looking at me, and then we look at something together, right? And we talk about that thing and we have this triadic interaction. And we see that Chinese parents are doing this way, way more in terms of proportion of time. And that's actually then reflected in the graph on the right in terms of thinking about how much they're actually then pointing, right? So we see that, for example, in these Chinese families, they're producing more points because they're engaging in more of this triadic interaction. And what's interesting is that these authors argue that it's not necessarily anything unique about the cultures themselves. What's unique here are sort of these different types of interactions and whether or not they're prioritized within the family. So what they say is that typically we might see that this is prioritized more in Chinese families, but that it's not necessarily anything about growing up in China specifically that would lead to this. So I guess to answer your question, we see that there are certainly similarities, quite a few similarities across cultures in terms of sort of the onset of pointing and the fact that parents and kids, even at very young ages, are pointing for each other. But the ways in which caregivers interact with their kids, whether they're emphasizing this kind of triadic interaction, would then influence the extent to which it's occurring. So I guess the answer is a little bit yes and a little bit no.
That's awesome. That's how most scientific questions are answered.
Right. Yeah, it's complicated.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you think about how a lot of this has to do with the family dynamics, humans aren't the only animals with these family dynamics. Are there
Sure.
other animals that have similar interactions?
Yeah. So lots of researchers are really interested in comparing nonverbal communication across species. And part of the reason for this is because as humans, we're always excited to try to find evidence of how uniquely capable and wonderful we are. And so to do this within the domain of communication, folks have tried to look at whether, for example, non-human primates can produce and comprehend pointing, for example, in the same way that humans can. And so sort of long story short, most research suggests that non-human primates like bonobos and chimps are not particularly good at producing or comprehending pointing in general, but we also know that they're super, super smart. So depending on the circumstances in which they find themselves, they can learn it. So generally, most folks would argue that it might not be in their repertoire as sort of like out in the wild when they're interacting with conspecifics, other chimps, for example, but that when they're in the right context, they can pick it up, they can learn it. And there's actually a really interesting study that some folks did about 10 years ago now, looking at non-human primates' ability to learn pointing, the meaning of pointing. And this is an interesting study because they compared a group of chimps that were living at Yerkes, so down in Georgia. And these chimps, their interactions with humans, this YNPRC group over here in the white bars, these guys generally didn't interact with humans very much. Their interactions were sort of husbandry type things, right? Like getting feedings or changing pens. They live in sort of a very wide open campus where they don't interact with humans very much at all. But then these two other groups, the Gati group are bonobos that were raised in sort of like a language-rich, close human environment. And the LRC group are chimps that were also raised in sort of like a language-rich environment. And they wanted to see whether these different contexts would affect their ability to comprehend pointing. And so you can see what the trials look like here. They would hide like a really delicious treat inside one of these two tubes and then point. And so like for us as humans, this seems super easy, right? Like, oh, well, okay, I'm just gonna then look in the tube that you're pointing at. Like that's straightforward. I really love M&Ms, and so I'm gonna like do what I can to get that M&M. Turns out, even after lots and lots and lots of practice, our chimps and bonobos who have lots of interaction with humans are like okay at it, right? You can see there's still a lot of variation here, but they're performing on a whole above chance. But our chimps who don't interact with humans very much, they're performing sort of at chance here, meaning that they're just as likely to select the empty tube that's not being indicated as they are the one that's indicated by pointing. And the argument that Lynn and colleagues make here is they say, well, you know, it's not that chimps and bonobos can't do it, but that and that it might actually be in their repertoire, but that they need to be in the right sort of ecological context. They need to be in a situation where it's actually useful for them to learn how to use this cue. Because of that, people have also thought about the difference between non-human primates and dogs, for example. And the reason dogs are seen as a really interesting comparison group is because of their domestication history. So dogs have been closely domesticated by humans. They have a close working relationship with humans. And also dogs, unlike non-human primates, in the wild tend to be more cooperative, right? They hunt in packs and they do this sort of more cooperative type of sort of pack-oriented work. And so folks have also compared dogs and non-human primates as well. Just to highlight quickly some of the research on this, there's this interesting study by Brower and colleagues where they looked at dogs and chimps' ability to process social nonverbal cues, things like pointing, causal nonverbal cues, so like if I hid something under a blanket, you would see a bump, right? So it made a cause, like, do you understand then that it's hidden under there? And a control where there wasn't really any cue at all. You can see that dogs compared to these chimps are actually pretty good. This is the percentage of correct trials. It's a little bit of a tricky graph because the bottom starts at 40. But you can see that the dogs on a whole are really good at processing the social cues, like pointing. The chimps are not so great at the social cues, but they're really good at the causal cues. And they say that makes sense because chimps as foragers need to be really good at picking up this causal information. They don't really need to be as good at picking up the social information. And you can see it broken down over here on the right. So these are the social cues, point and look, and control. And you can see that the dogs are really, really awesome at following humans' points. They really understand the pointing in terms of being able to follow it and search in the correct location. So the argument is here that it's partially genetic, something about the species in terms of how they live in the wild, right? Cooperative versus non-cooperative species, but also their history of having interacted with humans and how that sort of promotes for some species a need to actually be able to follow these cues.
Yeah, that is exactly what I was thinking when you were describing that is if they need to, sure, but not everybody seems to really have the need for that.
Right, exactly. And, you know, some people have a more sort of lean interpretation where they're like, well, non-human primates don't have theory of mind. They're not cooperative. They just don't get it at all. And it's all conditioning. And others have a little bit more of a rich interpretation where they say, well, it's possible, but why use it or why learn it? Why expend the energy if it's not functional for them day to day?
All right, well, we're getting carried away because this is so interesting, but we do need to open up for audience questions now. We'd love to hear what you guys are wondering about. We have plenty more questions, but we're gonna hold off for a second. If you wanna type out your question, please go to the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. Alternatively, if you use the raise your hand function, we can unmute you, and then you can ask your question verbally. So this is still going back to the, would you like to be an auditory communicator or not?
Hey, exactly. Oh, I didn't mean to do that, but anyway, sorry, everyone.
Okay, so we have one question from Chris who says, interesting, on the point look graph, what does look mean? Looking where someone else is looking?
Yes, exactly. So following gaze. So in this, it would be like if I made eye contact with you and was very clear that I'm now going to try to tell you something by making eye contact and then looking over towards something. Exactly.
All right, and Brian asks, what kind of dogs were used in these studies? Were they already well trained?
Yeah, that's a great question. This particular study actually used a really large group of dogs, so it's a pretty broad cross section. They're mostly pet dogs, so these are dogs that folks bring into the lab and they're like, "Oh, Fido, like you want to participate in the study?" So like most pet dogs, these dogs probably had like a little bit of training as young dogs. Maybe they went to like an obedience school or something like that, but probably not a ton of training. It's a really great question though, because some folks have tried to tease this apart a little bit more by actually comparing certain breeds that typically have a working relationship with humans. So working dogs, for example, versus non-working dogs. Um, and also, so just breed wise, but then also life experience. So like if I am actually a working dog versus a pet dog. And the research suggests that breed can help here. So even if I'm not actually a working dog, but I'm a working dog breed, I'm better at following, pointing, and looking than other types of breeds. And I'm especially good at following, pointing, and looking if I'm a working dog that is actually working, right? Like I'm out in the fields, like herding sheep or whatever. And so it suggests that there's both sort of a genetic component there for these dogs, but that is also an experience-based component.
Well, that is fascinating. Okay, we got two more questions about cats because you talked a lot about dogs and monkeys, but what about cats? Are they also going to react to humans, or would they be expected to show dog-like behaviors?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm a cat owner. And so I always hold out hope that cats could be sort of grouped in with dogs. The domestication process, for those of you who are cat fiends like myself, for cats, you may know, is pretty different from how dogs are domesticated. So, like, dogs were sort of purposefully domesticated, whereas cats were kind of like, oh, maybe there are like mice around humans. I'll hang around you for my own benefit and not necessarily with like a joint goal to work together to solve problems like herding sheep or cattle or doing other work. And so, there is some research to suggest that cats are able to follow cues occasionally. But one, it's harder to do the research with cats because they just are less motivated by their interactions with humans. And also, it's just a little bit more inconsistent. So while there's a ton of data out there on how dogs are really cued into humans' cues, there's just less consistent data for cats. And it's partially domestication. There might be some other things too. Um, Many of you have probably heard about or read that research where, like, when we put dogs in an MRI, an fMRI, for example, like the emotion centers of their brains light up when they hear their human's voice, right? There's like they have this like really strong bond with their caregivers, and cats just don't have it. So it's disappointing for us cat people. But there is a pretty big distinction there, I would say.
My cat just started yelling in the background in protest, so
Yeah, sounds like a cat thing to do. Yeah.
yeah. I wanna make sure that we have time to get to the other vignettes though. So we'll get to the questions that were not answered yet later. And now let's shift gears and ask, what is your current research focus?
Yeah, so my research is focused on what we call epistemic trust. So, how kids come to develop an understanding of who might be knowledgeable or reliable in their environment and who might be less knowledgeable or less reliable. And the reason, I'm really interested in this and others are interested in this is because we know that a lot of what kids learn from the world around them is actually coming, and I realize I have no need for you guys to be seeing that really big anymore. So there's no, a lot of what kids learn about the world around them is actually coming from what other people tell them, right? So it's really important that they identify good sources of information and avoid the bad ones. And I explore that through a bunch of different types of questions. Right now, we have sort of two broad lines of research in the lab. One looking at how kids use these nonverbal cues, like pointing and other types of behaviors like that, to identify knowledgeable folks. And then also a line of research that hopefully I'll get a chance to talk a little bit more about today, which I guess broadly construed could be considered nonverbal communication, which is actually our appearance. So how we use facial features, others' facial features, to identify who we think might be a good source of information versus less reliable.
So what are cues that I could give to establish that I'm a trustworthy person?
Yeah. Oh man. So it turns out kids are super sensitive to all kinds of different cues. So this process starts for kids, sort of, we start to see signs of it as early as 2, where kids are able to, if someone says something that's incorrect, like they hold up a ball and they say, "This is a shoe." Kids as young as 2 will like protest that and be like, "No, that's not a shoe." But so even as early as 2, we see that kids are starting to evaluate the nature of what other people are saying. But this process of identifying good sources of information really gets into full swing around 4 or 5. And kids around this age are able to track all kinds of things. So previous behavior, right? Like what you've said and done in the past. So were you correct or incorrect about objects? Were you nice or not so nice? We know they're able to pay attention to group membership. So like, are you an in-group member? Are you an out-group member? They use very simple things like, do you talk the way I talk, right? Have the same accent as I do, as indicators of that, and also how they look. And so does someone look smart? Do they look nice? That kind of thing. So there's a wide range of different things. But I think the big message is that kids are paying attention to a lot. They're tracking it. And that by the time they're 4 or 5, not only are they tracking the information, they're tracking the frequency, right? So they're able to say like, well, 4 out of 5 times you were right about those things. So that's pretty good. I guess I'll trust you, versus someone who's never right, for example.
So they really are always watching.
Yeah, yeah.
And you touched a little bit on how these cues will change across development. And I'm curious what you think about, you probably don't have any data on this because it's so recent, but in 2020, we're wearing masks and doing all this virtual learning. And how do you think that's impacting these things?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Lots of people are really interested in this. I think I don't have any strong sense of what exactly might be happening for older kids. I know that in the world of sort of word learning and language learning, there's lots of questions around the importance. We know that babies, for example, spend a lot of time looking at our mouths when we're talking so that they can figure out how articulation works and how to say words and things like that. So I think, researchers on listservs and stuff that I'm on are asking questions, right? It's like, if babies are spending a lot of time interacting with masked caregivers, is that going to be affecting their language learning, their word production, that kind of thing? Personally, I think the general consensus is that it probably won't, because even if I'm as a baby, spending a lot of time with a masked caregiver at like a daycare, for example, I'm also spending a lot of time with unmasked individuals in my home and things like that. There's also cultures out there where mouths tend to be covered, right? So like if I'm growing up where caregivers are wearing hijabs, for example, mouths may be covered in those situations. And there's no evidence to necessarily suggest that that means that they develop language later or in a slower way. So I think that's a really interesting question. But as you said, one, I don't actually have any data, so I don't want to hang my hat on anything. But I think also we know that this is a process that has so much variation in terms of the context in which kids are learning, that this might just be another source of variation. But since it's such a robust skill that we really seem to be cued into having, I think it's resilient would be my answer.
That's good to know, or good to assume, I guess.
Yeah, it's overly optimistic. Maybe I'll let you know in like 2 years.
Awesome. We'll keep our ears peeled for that one.
Okay, great.
So in terms of trustworthiness across different cultures, like you were just discussing, you study snap judgments a lot. And when we make these snap judgments, do factors such as race, ability, gender, these kinds of things, how do they factor in, if they do at all?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple different domains in which this plays a role. So I talked a little bit before about how kids are sensitive, for example, to like in-group members versus out-group members. Unfortunately, yes, like kids, even by 4 or 5, are able to say like, oh, you look like me or you talk like me, therefore you are a better source of information. We try to put like a more optimistic spin on it and say, well, it's because they think that that person might have relevant knowledge. They're within their cultural group, and so that person might have more relevant knowledge. But it's also sort of the origins, the beginnings of how we develop preferences for our in-group members. And so there's evidence of that. There's also evidence in the sort of other area of research in terms of face judgments, right? So when we're judging people based on how they look, adults do this all the time. There's a ton of data out there about how we make snap judgments about people based on their facial appearance. The judgments are not necessarily accurate, but we do it all the time. And I guess if I have a minute, I'll show you some examples first with adults, and then we can think about what it means for kids. So I just want to give you 2 quick examples of like what these types of snap judgments might mean, and how it relates to race and other types of differences. Let's see. You'd think after a semester of teaching over Zoom that I would be more comfortable showing you guys something. So one example of sort of like the real world implications of these types of snap judgments is predicting election outcomes. So this is a study done by Alex Todorov at Princeton University. In this study, they presented participants with 2 different candidates who had run for office in like 2004 and 2005. And they made sure that the participants had never seen these people before. They didn't know who they were, but they were actual candidates who were running for office. And then they asked the folks which one of these 2 people looks more competent, right? So they wanted to know, just snap judgment, look at them really quickly and tell me which one you think looks more competent. What they found was that like consistently people identified the man, in this case it was all men, who won the election as also looking more competent, right? So in this snap judgment, these participants aligned really closely with the actual voting outcome. So even when we feel like, oh, like I'm carefully deliberating about who I'm going to vote for based on their principles, well, it turns out that also tends to align very closely with how we identify, snap judgments, who's more competent. We also see this coming out too in prison sentencing. And I will just quickly skim through this to say that like in this study, they asked adults to identify folks as looking more or less trustworthy. And people who were identified as looking less trustworthy consistently were more likely to be on death row than were folks who were received life sentences. And again, this is all just sort of stemming from these like snap judgments about their faces. So then when it comes time to thinking about like, well, so then what does this look like in kids, and how does race and all this other stuff play in? There's some interesting research, but it's very, very new. You can see this was published in 2019, looking at how kids start to sort of think about race in terms of making these judgments. And obviously the judgments are really important. They have these big implications. In this study, they had kids look at pairs of faces. So in this case, they were asking them which one of the faces looks nice. So of the 2 faces in each pair, which of the faces is a nice face? Some of the pairs were same race, and one was the nice face. So the white boxes here highlight the nice looking face. And sometimes you can see a same race pair here, but sometimes there were different race pairs. So here the black face was the less nice of the 2, and the white face was more nice, and then the opposite over here on the right. And they just wanted to see like how same race versus different race combinations would affect kids' choices about which one looked nice. And you can see in the graph here how this changes between the ages of 4 and 14. So this is picking the expected face. So when they were showed these pairs, how often did kids pick the actually sort of nice looking face in a white pair, black pair, black positive, white negative, etc. So as you're looking at these lines, I think the one that is particularly interesting to the researchers is this one here. This is the black negative, white positive face. You can see as kids are getting older, they're actually less likely to pick the white positive face in this pair. So they're essentially more likely to pick the Black negative face as looking nice. And the authors say that what's happening here are some changing perspectives as kids are getting older, right, between 4 and 14, in terms of sort of social norms and equity, and trying to kind of walk the line of understanding that race is kind of a challenging subject, and that it might be uncomfortable or inappropriate for them to identify a Black person as looking not nice. And this is true even for white and Black kids, right? So it's not that this is like a whole sample of white kids. So I guess this was a really long-winded way of me saying that we know that these judgments are important. They drive all kinds of important things that we do day to day. And when it comes time to thinking about how race and gender plays a role here, it turns out that young kids might not really think much about race, right? You can see that they're all sort of clustered here in terms of picking the expected face at age 4, but that as kids get older, it really starts to change. And these other societal factors start to play into how children make these types of judgments. So they're maybe not sort of snap judgments in the same way that they are under other circumstances.
All right, so you've given us a lot to think about right before our next Q&A section. If anybody has a question, please either raise your hand or type it in the chat. I just had one question to start us off. Was that study you just discussed done in the United States, or I'm sorry if you already said where it
Yeah,
was?
sorry. So it was done in the United States. Tessa Charlesworth is at Harvard. And so this study was done, in the sort of Boston metro area, but they also use MTurk. So they're also collecting data online. So the older kids might have participated really from anywhere in the US. But yeah.
All right, great. So it looks like we have a hand raised, Connie Parks. Can you unmute yourself and ask a question? We can't hear you. Can you unmute yourself? All right, well, it seems that we had some technical difficulties, but we do have a question from Annabelle. I was wondering whether in the world of social media and technology, where the verbal language is ever changing, does it also affect nonverbal language in young children when exposed to technology early in childhood?
Yeah, so there's a lot out there about how technology affects kids. There's like low level stuff even, right? Like preschoolers who watch more TV have less white matter in their brain and all kinds of things like that. So certainly, like, we know that exposure to screen time is affecting kids even at very low levels. In terms of thinking about what that means for communication, both verbally and non-verbally, there's evidence to suggest that watching something on a screen or engaging with screen media isn't necessarily all bad if it's happening when kids are actively engaging with an in-person caregiver at the same time. So most of the research suggests that, like, if a caregiver or another adult is sitting with them, sort of asking questions about it, sort of engaging with them around that type of media, that actually can be productive in terms of word learning and learning other concepts and actually retaining that information. But that it becomes a completely different story if we're like, okay, child, sit here in front of the TV. I need to like take half an hour to like fold laundry or like write an email or whatever. If it's more of like a babysitter technique, that is a very different way of consuming that media, and that then the learning isn't really happening there. So I'm not sure if that exactly answers your question, but I would say that most researchers who are interested in media consumption would say that it's not all bad if kids are actively engaged with an adult as they're doing it.
All right, now we've got another one from Janelle. In terms of making those snap judgments, have you seen differences in terms of cultural norms or facial expressions? So in cultures where the language involves big faces, huge smiles, eyebrow raising, do kids respond more or different than those people versus smaller facial changes?
Yeah. So something that's just popping into my head is like, for example, there are certainly cultural norms around expressiveness. So um, children raised in Japan, for example, are much more sensitive to changes in people's eyes to express their emotions versus kids being raised in the US are much more sensitive to people's mouths. The thinking is that like it's a lot harder to modify or to lie about how I feel with my eyes than it is to lie using my mouth. And because folks in Japan tend to have norms around being less expressive, the eyes are actually like the better place to go to identify what someone's actually thinking or feeling. Whereas in the US, we're just like, yeah, very like open, free, whatever. And so using a mouth is, a good cue. In terms of thinking about what that means for kids, as far as I know, most of the data that I'm familiar with on that is with like college age students and older. But personally, I don't have any reason to believe that kids who are sensitive to emotion differences, and we know babies as young as like 7 months can process emotions in others' faces, it would suggest that cultural differences, cultural norms could be influencing their processing in babies even that young. So I don't know if it necessarily, if I think it's an interesting and open question, at least in terms of what I'm familiar with about the SNAP judgments in particular, right? So like, are you competent or are you nice? But in terms of emotions, there certainly is research out there to suggest that cultural differences can influence what we look at in a face to establish emotional content.
Well, I think that's actually a perfect transition into our next vignette. And I do hope that Connie, you are able to type out your question for the next Q&A section. But you were just discussing how a lot of the academic knowledge that we've gathered is based on college students. So
Right.
I'm wondering, who do you study in your research and how do you recruit participants?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a problem, I would say, with a lot of psychological research is that we typically rely on college age students who are, in intro psych classes, or folks who live in communities close to college campuses. And just like pretty much every developmental psychologist, I'm primarily recruiting, from people who live in the area. But I think that in the recent, past 10 or 15 years, psychologists have been working hard to move away from what we call these weird samples, right? So an acronym, right? W, Western, E is educated, I is industrialized, R is rich, and D is developed. I always forget, is that right? These weird samples, because they're not necessarily as useful for thinking about generalizability. And so one thing that we try to do in the lab is to try to move beyond that in a couple different ways. So we do have folks from the community that live here in Amherst and Northampton and things like that come into the lab here on campus. We also visit local schools, thinking that both public and private, thinking that that opens up a little bit folks who have less flexibility. And then we also try to recruit a little bit more broadly to participate in our studies. We like to go down to Holyoke and Springfield to go to local children's museums and family events. We particularly try to target free and reduced admission days in those different types of museums in the hopes that we can get folks who might not always be visiting those places in a day-to-day basis to begin with. I think, living in Western Massachusetts certainly poses some issues when it comes to trying to collect a diverse sample. But I do think that there are also unique resources that are sometimes underutilized, like thinking about our immigrant populations living in Holyoke and Springfield, for example. One of the silver linings of going online is that we're now posting our studies on childrenhelpingscience.com, which is a plug for all of you out there with kids. So it's sort of a clearinghouse for developmental psychologists to post studies for infants through adolescence. And it's accessible around the world. You can just click and create an appointment and sign up for a study. We're hopeful that this might also help to reduce some barriers that people have around participating and possibly create more diverse samples in our studies. So far, I think a lot of people are zoomed out and they're like, I don't really want to do a study over the computer, but we're still staying optimistic about it.
That's awesome. So I'm just going to put some stuff in the chat based on what you just said. We've got people are interested in learning more about weird science. there's an article there that I happen to have just written, shameless plug for myself. And then if you are interested in helping out with Carrie's research, childrenhelpingscience.com. Tell me if that's incorrect, but I think that's the right address.
Childrenhelpingscience.com, exactly. Yeah, and there's oodles of studies out there, tons.
Awesome. So now, what do you do when you do get these participants?
Oh, so many different things. There's, as I said, we have sort of two big lines of research in my lab, and they sort of, one looks at kind of nonverbal communication, the other's looking at this snap judgment research. And typically we try to structure our studies in ways that are short and fun and sort of game-like for kids. Most of our research is done with kids between the ages of 3 and 6. So we try to keep the studies short and interesting. And that's sort of the short and sweet answer. But I think maybe I'll show you a quick video of a clip of a study. One study that we recently published just this year looked at children's expectations about knowledge of different individuals. We showed them 2 puppets, and one puppet had a face that was typically competent looking as judged by adults, and one had a face that was typically sort of incompetent looking as judged by adults. And we asked them who would know more about these different, or who would behave more knowledgeably. And then we also showed them a different pair, different set of kids, a trustworthy looking face and an untrustworthy looking face, and similarly asked them, who would know more, who would behave more knowledgeably. And so this feels a little bit abstract, but I'll show you the clip and hopefully it'll make it a little bit clearer. Hold on one second. Let's see. I just did a really Cliff's Notes version of all of this. Told you about the different objects. Oh, here are our puppets, right? So we showed them puppets, one that was more competent looking and one that was sort of incompetent looking. These are faces that were developed by Alex Todorov up at Princeton, or down at Princeton. And our trustworthy pair, who was less trustworthy or more trustworthy. Excuse me. Okay. And in order to not have the facial features affect kids' choices, we told them that these puppets like to wear masks. So you'll see us introducing this sort of, it looks like a wrestler's mask. It covers their whole face. And they'll engage in some behaviors, and then we'll remove the mask and ask the child who they think behaved knowledgeably or unknowledgeably. So we'll watch this quickly here.
Today, we're going to play a game with 2 of my friends. Do you want to meet my friends? Yeah? Okay. All right. So, just get them all ready. So here's my 2 friends. And I want you to look closely so you can see what they look like. So here's one of my friends. See what he looks like? No, you don't see him? You gotta look real close. There he is. Here's my other friend. Do you see what he looks like? Yeah? Okay. So my 2 friends love to wear masks. Do you want to see their masks? All right. So here's their masks. So I'm going to put a mask on this one. And I'm going to put a mask on this one. Okay. These are super silly masks, because when they wear their masks, you can't see their faces anymore. And guess what? I have a mask that's just your size. Do you want to try it on? Yeah? Is it a little tricky? All right, look at that. I can see you. Can you see me? See, that's what it's like when the puppets wear their masks. They can see through the holes. You can take it off if you want. I want to show my mom. You want to show your mom? Maybe after our game we can show mom, okay? All right. So if you want to just put that on the table and we'll show mom later. Okay, so my 2 friends are going to be wearing their silly masks for the rest of the game we play, okay? So now I'm going to bring out just one of my 2 friends. And I'm going to bring out some things to show you. Okay, so I'm going to ask my friend a question. Okay, friend, which one unlocks doors? So now it's your turn. Which one unlocks doors? What's that called? Keys. Keys, that's right. All right. So now, let's bring both of my friends back out. Okay, and let's take that off. All right, So who do you think we were just playing with in that part of the game? This one? This one? Yeah. And was he showing us the right thing or the wrong thing? The wrong thing. The wrong thing? Yeah. Did he know or not know about the things on the table? Not know. Not know. Okay. So let's play again.
Okay, so that gives you sort of a sense of what the studies look like. If we have time and people have questions, I can tell you about the results from that study. But, you know, again, game-like, short, fun. The whole goal is to obviously be able to elicit meaningful data from the kids, but to not necessarily make it taxing for them.
That was so fun and interactive. I felt like we were being interactive just like they were with the participant. But we're nearing the end, and I need to ask this one of the final questions because we're still going to open up for Q&A. So how has the need for inclusivity and diversity influenced how you do your work, and including how you interact with the nonverbal community in terms of disability justice, and just how are you thinking about this with your work?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Unfortunately, I don't have any specific studies of my own that have addressed this, but there's certainly researchers in the area who are interested in thinking about how we can broaden our definition of communication to bring in nonverbal individuals by better understanding the function that nonverbal communication can serve. Gosh, how much time do we have? I have like a really short video. It's like a 2-minute video. I have a colleague of mine who has recently gotten really interested in understanding the use of letter boards for nonverbal autistic individuals. And it's a sort of contentious communication form, because what happens is you hold up a board that has all the letters of the alphabet, and autistic individuals, nonverbal individuals can point to the letters to spell out words. And oftentimes an aide is holding the board for the individual who's doing the pointing. And it's contentious because people have said, oh, well, the aide is manipulating these folks' responses. They have the sort of control here. And this research was so exciting, so compelling, because what they did was they put eye trackers on nonverbal autistic individuals as they were using the letter boards. And they found that these folks were actually very planful in their use of the letter boards. Their gaze was tracking first to a letter, and then they would point, suggesting that they were planning out how they were going to spell these words, and that it wasn't actually controlled by the aides who were holding the letter boards. So I think, you know, research like this is really exciting and interesting, because it suggests that we can use our knowledge about how gaze and pointing works in sort of neurotypical individuals to extend that to better understand what communication might look like in nonverbal people. And helping us to understand that sort of having a broader definition in this way can bring people into the fold more, and rather than sort of counting them off, right, and saying, well, they can't communicate, they're nonverbal, instead to say, well, they actually have quite a capacity for communication if we broaden our definition.
That's awesome. And since we are running low on time and want to get audience questions, we can totally post that video on our website, so anyone can see it later. But now let's ask people for final questions for Dr. Carrie Palmquist. If anyone has some urgent questions. I know that there was one that we didn't get to earlier about an example of cats who don't look where we are looking, but they follow each other's behavior. And so if one looks with interest at a bug, the other two may come and look. Is that considered triadic?
Interesting. I wonder, so I think, you know, this is the problem with like trying to anthropomorphize other species, like interactions, and we run our heads up against this all the time in this area of research. I mean, I think if we wanted to try to think of it as triadic as humans do it, they would need to first establish joint attention. So like the cat that was looking at the bug first would need to like look at all the other cats and be like, look at what I see. And then the other cats come and look at the bug together. And maybe the cats then look at each other, and then they look back at the bug, and they like, that would be a triadic interaction in terms of like a human definition. Instead, I don't know, depending on the situation, you know, it might be more of a causal cue where they see, you know, one cat runs over to look at the bug, and the other cats see the cat run. And so then they go to run, and then they see, oh, there's this motion over here, and then they look at the bug. And in that case, it would be a sort of causal cue, much like what we see with chimps in that causal versus social comparison. So I think there's lots of species out there who are great at picking up on causal cues. It's really important to their survival. But I don't know if causal cues are necessarily equal to or the same as our social cues.
So we have to do a controlled experiment to answer your question. Sorry.
Yeah.
All right. Connie was able to write her question. So do you think older kids rely more on stereotypes and other neural or reasoning shortcuts in like an autopilot manner?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in terms of like those sort of like snap judgments, we know that adults certainly rely on these types of snap judgments when they're being asked to make a very quick evaluation of someone, and that they're more likely to do it when they only have a few moments to make an evaluation. And that actually judgments based on facial appearance, for example, sort of fall apart when we say, consider this face for a few minutes and then decide. That really what's happening here is this like a really low level, just like very quick evaluation. And when we're saying adults, right, these are like college samples, right? So adolescents and young adults. So I would say that we are all more likely to rely on stereotypes when we have diminished cognitive resources. So when we don't have as much time, we don't have as much opportunity to think carefully, that we rely on these because they are really helpful heuristics. We have to make decisions somehow. But that when we do have more time to contemplate and to think carefully, that we are able to move beyond those things.
Awesome. So Janelle wonders, what are things that we can do in daily life to be more inclusive to nonverbal individuals?
Oh, that's a great question. I wish that I had some like empirical thing to say there. I don't. But I would say that, again, to just reiterate this idea that it helps to be open-minded about how we are thinking about the ways in which folks can communicate with us. There's a really interesting paper published just this year by Jaswal and Akhtar, where they actually interviewed caregivers of autistic children. And they asked, do you think that your child communicates with you? And the caregiver said, it's going to sound really crazy, but I do. And let me tell you why. Sometimes my son will lean against me in a certain way, or he'll put his hand on my arm in a certain way that I know means that he's like trying to establish connection with me and wants me to look at something that he's looking at. And in this paper, they're arguing through these sort of anecdotal accounts that like this type of open-mindedness of kind of keeping a broad definition of how we can capture attention and how we can communicate through proximity and pressure on each other's bodies and things like that might be just as rich and informative as our sort of standard empirical definitions that we've been using for decades now.
Yeah, our standard as verbal individuals.
Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right. So Fred has their hand raised. Can you unmute yourself, Fred?
Can I speak?
I hear you.
I can hear you.
So I have this is not going to be easy to do, and I'll try and make it as brief as possible.
Okay.
I have a 5-year-old grandson who just moved here from California with my son and his wife, who he was brought up here, and he has limited verbal acuity. He is somewhat on the spectrum. He is bright. He's speaking to someone, an older guy in Northampton now, who is sort of a Mr. Rogers type and apparently is very well liked by my grandson. And we have he's just came here about a month or two ago. So my question is, if one wanted to speak to people who are doing this kind of work, he's 5 1/4, and it's not babbles, but he speaks in his own language, and he says things in his own way. And sometimes he speaks and you can understand words, and sometimes you can't. Who would one talk to within your areas to just get an idea of what may be available for him, and whether there are people who are doing this kind of research who may be available to him?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and probably one that a lot of people are thinking about. So I think it depends a little bit on what your goals are. So I think there are always researchers who are interested in recruiting people of various abilities to participate in studies. People are always interested in better
Right.
understanding like autism in general. But if you're
Well, by
looking
the way,
for,
they're not sure whether there may be some apraxia as well,
Mhm.
or
So if you're
not.
looking, yeah, so if you're looking more at trying to sort of better understand what his differences might be, I would, and maybe this has already been pursued or not, but I would definitely point you in the direction of getting an evaluation through like a speech language pathologist or an occupational therapist or something like that. They actually have those speech evaluations up at UMass. I think you have to wait a little while to get in. I don't know if they're doing them
How,
digitally these days.
I don't want to take too much time for you because I know there are other people. How would I pursue this? Who would I get in touch with outside of just this little conversation?
Yeah. So I would definitely look, I would start, because I think it's really the most straightforward. If he's not in a school system and he's not getting evaluated through like a school system, to go to UMass's website and look at the speech and language pathology group there.
Okay.
And if you go there, you'll see a wide range of different types of assessments that they can do there. And there's all different types of interventions that they can then also point you toward, either through their own program or through other folks in the community. So I would go to speech language pathology program.
Any particular person? Any
I don't
particular?
know any. I don't know any specific people up at UMass, unfortunately, and
Okay.
Amherst
Okay.
we don't. But I think it would be very clear if you went to their website, because it's an outward facing service. It's meant for the community. So I think
Okay.
that it
No,
would.
I'll do it. He's been involved with various different people in California and here, and we're just trying to meander our way through what's available here because he understands and he knows things and he's very aware, and he's bright, but he still has very little language.
Yeah, I would definitely start with an assessment, and it's tough in this digital time. Like if he were going to a
Of
school,
course.
he would already be folded into an in-school program probably, but UMass's resources are really great in that area. So I would definitely.
Yeah, we'll try because he was in Los Angeles programs out there and they were great, but now he's here.
Yeah. I wish you the
Okay,
best of
thank
luck.
you. I'll follow through on my own. Thank you.
Okay. Yes. Good luck.
We'll post a link to that on our website as well if you have trouble finding it. Okay, so one last question because we've gone over time. Matt would like to know, he says, very cool work and discussion. In the first segment, we talked a lot about whether animals can learn human cues. I know this is not your main bread and butter, but how about the reciprocal? How good are humans at understanding animal cues?
Yeah. Such a good question. I think the big problem that we have in this sort of like cross species type of research is that we're always going to try to process others' cues through our own lens, right? So as humans, we communicate cooperatively for the purpose of sharing information and supporting our, conspecifics, and that's sort of the lens through which we process communication. But it's not always the case that that's the primary goal for every species in communicating. There's actually quite a bit of research to show that chimps are actually a lot better at processing and understanding communicative cues that are competitive versus cooperative, right? Because they just kind of have a different mindset. So I think what's tricky is that as humans, we might think like, oh, well, we have a very good sense of what exactly is happening there and what they mean by that. I guess we have a leg up over non-human primates because as far as I know, they don't conduct empirical research. So like, I guess, we might be doing a better job at evaluating, but I do think that the problem is that it's very hard to know without actually being able to take the physical perspective of what it's like to be that species. And that's an issue with all cross-cultural or cross-species work. So I think comparative work of that kind is challenging. But I guess we do the best we can.
And they're not sharing their empirical research in a way that we can understand it. So.
Yeah, not open source as far as I know. Yeah.
All right, well, thank you so much. And for Jacqueline, we will give an answer to the outcome of that video we watched on the website, unless you wanted to give a really quick answer right now. You perked up, Carrie.
Oh yeah, sorry. The FACES study. What we found really quick was that kids surprisingly didn't expect a competent person to have behaved knowledgeably, but they did expect a trustworthy looking person to behave knowledgeably. And we have a whole bunch of ideas about why that is, but essentially it boils down to the fact that kids are much more sensitive to benevolence and niceness early, as compared to expertise or competence. So we just think that they're more sensitive to identifying friendly, warm, benevolent people early in life, and that over time they become more sensitive to whether someone is or appears more competent. So it was a surprising result, because why would you think that a nice person would be smarter, but that a smart person wouldn't be smarter? But we think it really is just stemming from developmental shifts where younger kids are just more in tune with identifying nice people.
And when you can identify nice people, sometimes you get farther in life, right? So that's
Yeah.
All right. Well, good wrapping up on a positive note. Thank you everyone who attended, and thank you so much to our special guest, Dr. Carrie Palmquist. I'll clap for everybody right now.
Thank you.
But that was really wonderful. And everything that we went over today will be posted on our website. So we got some thank yous for you, but have a wonderful evening, everybody.